Hello everyone, and welcome to another Bible study and episode review in Shady Oak Ministries. I am of course Shady Oak, and today we'll be going over episode 17 of season 4 of the TV show My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. The episode Somepony to Watch Over Me, and definitely one of the more entertaining episodes as far as the practical consequences and conflicts that come through a parent and child, student and teacher relationship. More literally in this case, an older and younger sister between Applejack and Apple Bloom. But in noting this episode was not only a beautiful reflection of knowing not to necessarily expect more or less from people in your relationships, it really narrows down to a reflection of God's character and not only how He relates to us, but how we relate to Him. And in starting this, I want to start with three main verses that we'll be repeating, revisiting, and analyzing as the three main points that were made in this episode being of biblical origin and point. If you could first turn to the book of Psalms, very big book, but it will be towards the beginning, and for chapter 32 of verse 9, we read a little bit more of God's commentary as to what He doesn't want out of His relationship with you, given the allegory and example of how you would treat an animal that you have to train. Psalm 32 and verse 9 says this, "Do not be like the horse or like the mule, which have no understanding, which must be harnessed with bit and bridle, else they will not come near you." Letting that sit just basically in the air for a second, I also want to move on to the second verse, which is the book of Jeremiah, one of the major prophets, chapter 7, and verses 5 through 7, where God is commentating on the social climate of Israel and telling them, basically, if they want to turn around from the disaster that they have coming to them, then simply start doing the right things, because the wrong things are actually to your disadvantage, not necessarily to mine. God said, "For if you thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute judgment between man and his neighbor," note, because they weren't, "if you do not oppress the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, or walk after other gods to your hurt, then I will cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers forever and ever." And note, God is emphasizing this point to Israel and saying, you think that by worshiping idols and turning to all of these different things other than me, basically setting your eternal hope on the things of this world and the temporal instead of the eternal, that it's somehow making me jealous or wanting to inspire me to get more involved in your lives? The opposite is true. You're just missing out on something better. But then also down to the third point that I want to execute for this episode, Galatians 3:23 through 25, Paul speaking to the majority of the churches in northern, basically Middle East, would be modern-day Turkey, but the easternmost section of the Roman Empire at the time. "But before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law, kept for the faith which would afterward be revealed. Therefore the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor." So Paul, in this letter and in this message, is clarifying doctrinal mix-ups that a bunch of false prophets had basically come in and distorted, and saying that, yeah, faith is good, trust in Jesus for salvation, but then you have to do all the right things. When in reality, Paul's saying doing all the right things, or at least knowing what the right and wrong things are, only proved that the only way we could be saved is through faith. But that we should move beyond that into, once learning right from wrong, make our own decision and the right decision and conclusion that's implied in saying we need a Savior. Making the right decisions with the right wisdom, not just knowing all the facts, but learning how to use them. Now, with these 3 points and with these 3 verses, we can get in today's episode in which I want to analyze the 3 main problems and obstacles that occurred between not only Apple Bloom and Applejack's relationship, but in generally their existence as living sentient beings as a whole, more directly than others in concerning their lives and future. But in the first problem, we would notice that with Apple Bloom being given the privilege of staying home alone, she was responsible. She was able to execute her chores well and simply do what was asked and required of her. Here's the 10 Commandments, and you can keep them. But AJ ended up being the one who first made the mistake because she was unwilling to see her sister face consequences. And this prevented her from not only growing by learning, but also enjoying anything as well. Because that's not the way that God functions with us. We would know from experience, for those who actually know Him personally, that the way God interacts with us in our lives isn't as a taskmaster, as a father who basically has the giant ruler stick and slaps you on the wrist the moment that you get out of line. Now note, He does chastise those that belong to Him, and we as a part of His flock, His rod and His staff are a comfort to us, because no father punishes someone who's not his son. Anyone who's tried this would know, for example, bad idea. But noting that God does not only discipline His children, but sometimes the foundation of discipline can be found through the school of hard knocks, the best education if you can afford the tuition. By preventing us from learning our own lessons the hard way, we would eventually end up becoming resentful of God, by preventing us from doing any sort of mistake whatsoever. Because while God is protecting us from the things that we would be doing wrong, in the exact same situation as Applebloom was kind of getting annoyed by Applejack babyifying everything, and preventing any sort of injury or risk involved, we see exactly why there were two options in the Garden of Eden. Because if God eliminated all second alternatives, then love would not have been a choice. We would have just naturally been doing the one thing that we could possibly have done, is choose a relationship with God. That's why when we've used this allegory before, when you ask someone to marry you, you don't say, you and I are now married, you say, will you marry me? That's a question which implies a yes or no answer, of which, hopefully, it's easy for them to make that conclusion, but they still get to consider it. It's not meant to be up in the sweep of the emotions in the moment, but actually meant to be a sacred binding between two people that's literally a choice on one or the other person's part. In the exact same situation in our relationship with God, if He made sin impossible, if He made His children being hurt impossible, if every time I got tempted and wanted to walk away from God and do something, like if I wanted to, go on a club site or something, and God just shut down my internet, yeah, I'd be prevented from poisoning my own brain. But the problem is, God's not letting me learn to choose Him as something better. He's preventing me from any other choice. And here's the good thing about discipline. It's establishing self-control through controlled consequences. It's, as the theologian and comedian Brad Stein once said, a swat at 6 keeps you from a bail bondsman at 16. It's not complicated. And I'm thankful that I was spanked as a kid. But here's the important thing, is that when I was little, my parents were able to introduce consequences to me early. And while it was painful not only for me, but even more so for them, of that I understand fully now. But the same thing is true when God allows difficult circumstances to come into our lives, but they don't end up killing us. We realize that God isn't cruel or sadistic and bringing us to the edge of destruction and then halting back all the pain and then just letting us lie in agony with our scars. No, He allows us to face consequences early like a loving parent, in the same way that I did, in that if I were to threaten a kid in grade school, say for example, literally speaking from experience, and they ended up taking away all of my privileges, all of my stuff, basically grounded for months in a state of perpetual boredom, isolation, and having nothing to do, literally simulating prison in my own home. But if I had done the exact same thing when I was 23, well, then the police would be involved, the matter would be taken quite seriously, and I would not be in a state where I would get my privileges back, quote-unquote, when my parents felt that I had learned my lesson. I'd be under contract, under state confinement, and surrounded by a lot less pleasant people than the ones who are cooking my meals, if you catch my drift. This was the first problem, is that by God being a loving Father, He not only allows discipline, but gives us the opportunity to make our own mistakes so we learn our own lessons. Applebloom would not have grown in the slightest if she was treated like a baby forever. We need to start taking care of ourselves. And God allows that while simultaneously protecting us from some of the greatest threats to our lives as possible. And He knows what we can handle. But also noting this, that leads us into the second problem, in noting that the first point, the first verse, is that you don't want to be like a horse or a bridle, basically having to be guided by some metal shard in your mouth pulling you every which way in that. Otherwise, they won't come near you. God doesn't want a relationship with you like a rider has to be to his horse, who has to introduce pain and force you to do things that you don't want to do, but that in order to alleviate the pain, alleviate the tension, alleviate the discipline, you have to go this way. God will do that if that's the only way he can keep you alive, but it's the last thing he wants for you, because in Applebloom's situation here, that was not necessary, and which is why there was created resentment. But then we're led into the second verse, where following after idols and doing things that rebel against God aren't to God's insult, but they're only to our hurt. By settling for something less, in fact something poisonous in this case, and something dangerous, something a threat to our lives as a whole, we get a beautiful example of what was going on with that Chimera run-in in the fire swamp. Applebloom put herself in danger to prove her capabilities of overcoming it to AJ, but the reason that she didn't allow Applebloom to go to those certain places wasn't to take away her fun. It was to keep her from something she didn't know how to deal with yet. She didn't know about having fireproof stockings and bringing a chair to deal with the tiger head and whatever the brand of cheese was that would pacify the goat. Ricotta, that was it. Why that type, I don't know. I don't hang around goats too often, let alone chimeras. I've never seen one, but maybe someday. Anyway, noting that this was also the problem, that by Applebloom rebelling against AJ, even though AJ, yes, did make a mistake, she was a misrepresentation of God, Applebloom was a good representation of us, in that when we rebel, we're only hurting ourselves, because God didn't put those barriers between us to keep us from something fun. He's keeping the dangerous stuff as far from us as possible. When God says, don't do that, he really means don't hurt yourself, and you can take that to the bank. Tweet it if you like. But then we reach the third problem, in the conclusion to all of this, where AJ came to save Applebloom whenever she needed her, that Applejack, as her older sister and guardian, we see that proper relationship with God that we have, that he lets us make our own decisions, learn our own lessons, but he will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able, and even more so on top of that, he has a better plan for us than just having to go from instruction to instruction and give us a list of chores when we should already know them ourselves. AJ and Applebloom were both forgetting the very same thing. This was the struggle, this was the message of today's episode. Faith. Now I know this is probably like causing an eye twitch in some of you guys. Like, faith, where are you getting that? Hebrews 11:1, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I mean, why do we have to focus on things that we don't see? Oh, that's right, trust. Trust is the key, basically the most simplistic way that you could put faith, trusting in something even though that you can't see it. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20 and verse 29, we remember that very amusing account of doubting Thomas, which we don't give as much credit for. He was a very practical and very direct individual. But here's the thing. In this passage, after Jesus had resurrected from the dead, he was the last of the disciples to see Jesus, because his only conditions to believe Jesus could pull off a miracle, let that hang out there for a second, like raising himself from the dead, would be to see the nails and to put his hands in his side. So show me the scars then if you say that you have actually been set on fire, right? Well, Jesus appeared, he showed him the nail scars, and he actually put his fingers through, put his hand into his side. Thomas fell at his feet and said, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said this to him, verse 29, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet have believed." Now, the point of this is not to say that the only way to enjoy God is get used to never having physical and visual evidence, that you have to always go off of some allegorical concept of the unknown and trust that there will be a net at the bottom when you finally pass into the spiritual. That's not it. What Jesus is talking about is exactly the same problems that Moses was dealing with Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, just like the people of Israel were in their wanderings in the wilderness. And just like with AJ and Applebloom, AJ could not trust that Apple Bloom was mature enough to make her own decision. She had no faith in her sister, because even though there was proof, there was past evidence, there was examples of Apple Bloom being a responsible young filly, she still felt like she had to baby her. That even though AJ had never led Apple Bloom to dangerous situations before, had never lied to her before, had never misled or deceived her in any way, she rebelled against her to try and prove a point to her, not having faith in her sister to know what's best for her. And with Israel and Pharaoh and them constantly doubting, well, I see God's miracles, I see Him provide water for more than 9 million people, I believe, God, thank you for providing for us. But then they get hungry and they say, why has God given us this worthless manna? Ungrateful for angel food cake. But then turning aside and saying, why can't we have meat and leeks and onions like we did back in Egypt? And God said, all right, have meat, but here's the thing, those doves are diseased. And the reason why I haven't been letting you eat anything but what I provide is because everything else is unhealthy. Why did God say don't eat pork? Was it because He wanted to keep them from a BLT, or because they didn't know how to cook it yet, and God did not want trichinosis for His people? Just putting that out there. We enjoy God most when we remember that He only wants the best for us, and that we remember that He always lets us make our own choices when it comes to the most important things, which is what I'm telling you right now. God has laid your eternal destiny at your own feet, and you can choose to either trust by faith that what Jesus did for you was enough to forgive your sins, and believe that with God's track record, His history, His interactions with your life, and getting you this far, and giving you this opportunity here to receive Him, He has not given up on you. But that even more so, you can also know that the character of God is not the one that would pull a fast one on you. Know that right now. God is worth trusting your life in, because He hasn't let one astray now, and He won't start today. But that comes at the trusting, at the remembering that by faith we are saved. Not of works, it is the gift of God, lest anyone should boast. And just remember that for you now today, you have that choice, you have that decision. And I encourage and almost beg all of you to make that today while it's still called today. Because God is not only worth trusting in, His life is not only worth living, but He also allows you to live and experience life, and to see more and more every day that everything that He has in store for you is not only good, but it's great. There's no chimeras, there's no fire swamps, and when you finally do reach those points, He makes sure you're well armed for the occasion. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you. If you have any questions or would like to know more concerning the topics discussed, leave them in the comments. If something was unclear, again, I will specify. I'd be happy to meet those who have sincerity in their hearts. But if you want to encourage the ministry, leave a like and subscribe. But most importantly, if you want to help the gospel go out to our beloved fan base, please share this video and this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Anyone who you feel would need to hear it. Thank you for your time listening to this study, and God bless you.